59-year-old architect Rex Heuermann has been arrested as of July 2023 as being the key suspect in the infamous Gilgo Beach serial killings or the Long Island serial killings. But in as much as this has dominated the news, I think that it's important that we try to go back to understand everything that went into the Gilgo Beach serial killings in order to appreciate the extent of how far this case goes back and the depth of the crimes committed by whoever the perpetrator actually was. This is a video going to summarize everything that has been known about the Gilgo Beach serial killings, right from how the issues started, the various victims that have been taken as a result of this issue, how the police went about their investigations, additional victims that were found between 2011 and 2010, in addition to the Gilgo 4, the discovery of Shannon Gilbert's body, timelines as far as this case is concerned, other possible victims, and profile of various suspects and persons of interest along the years, right up to the point where Rex Heuermann was arrested in July 2023 as the key suspect, with investigations still ongoing. So I'm going to chronicle everything, and then further videos are going to come out breaking the subsequent things that have unraveled leading to Rex Heuermann's arrest and the issues that have come up thereafter. Now, the Gilgo Beach serial killings were a series of killings between 1996 and 2011 in which the remains of up to 18 people were found in Gilgo Beach, located on the south shore of Long Island, New York, in the United States of America. Most of the known victims were sex workers who advertised on Craigslist. The perpetrator in this case was eventually given the nickname the Long Island serial killer, which over time people came to abbreviate as LISK, L-I-S-K. This case garnered so much popularity because it traveled over years, and in as much as suspects were eventually mentioned, none of them could actually stick. Now, the victims' remains were found over a period of months in 2010 and 2011, and it became a very disturbing situation for residents of the Long Island area. And these victims' remains were found after the disappearance of a lady called Shannon Gilbert, which resulted in a police search of the area along the Ocean Parkway near the remote beach towns of Gilgo and Oak Beach in Suffolk County. Please take key notice of these names as they are very critical in the understanding of how things will unfold from this point. So when these remains were found, the remains of the 4 victims designated the Gilgo 4 were found within a quarter of a mile of each other near Gilgo Beach in December of 2010. At a point, the case seemed like something that the police will have to battle with over a long period of time because nothing was adding up from the onset. Because the first discovery of human remains was made by the side of Ocean Parkway in Oak Beach on December 11th of 2010, but then the investigation was prompted by the search of Shannon Gilbert, the 24-year-old woman who had disappeared in that area. The officer made a new attempt at a search on December 11th, 2010, staying close to the shoulder of that parkway, and he based his choice of search area on FBI data indicating that dumped bodies are frequently found close to roadways. So you could see that this officer by name Malia was really cunning. This is somebody who doesn't just go out to do his work, but he has a method to his madness. And using this FBI profile, he was able to direct his search to be most effective, which led to this finding. Now, despite the thick vegetation and a light layer of snow, Malia's cadaver alerted to a scent which the pair tracked to a skeleton in a disintegrating burlap bag. The remains were later identified as a young woman by name Melissa Bethlehem. Police discovered 3 additional bodies after this while searching the scene for further evidence. The bodies of the 4 victims, namely Maureen Brainerd, Melissa Bethlehem, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, were found approximately 500 feet from each other. Fast forward, in March of 2011, partial remains of Jessica Taylor were found along Ocean Parkway. 8 years earlier, in 2003, other parts of Taylor's remains had been found in Manorville, a town in Suffolk County. Now, the next month, in April of 2011, police discovered 3 additional sets of remains, which are an unidentified female toddler, an unidentified Asian person, and Valerie Mack, all with partial remains of whom, like those of Jessica Taylor, had been found in Manorville years earlier in November 2000. 2 more bodies were found in Nassau County, and these were an unidentified woman whose partial remains had previously been found on Fire Island in 1996, and then an unidentified woman with a distinctive tattoo of peaches who was later found to be the mother of the unidentified toddler found in Suffolk County. So it seemed like somebody was taking the lives of these women and dismembering them and spreading them across the state. Now, on the 9th of May 2011, police speculated that because of similarities in the cases, Valerie Mack, who at the time was unidentified, and Jessica Taylor may have been murdered by a second separate killer. On 29th of November 2011, police announced that they believed one person to be responsible for all 10 murders of these women, and that the perpetrator is almost certainly from Long Island. The single killer theory stems from common characteristics between the condition of the remains and forensic evidence related to the bodies at the time. In June of 2011, Suffolk County Police announced a $25,000 reward for information leading to an arrest in the Long Island murders. Now, Shannon Gilbert's remains were located in Oak Beach in December of 2011, which was 19 months after her disappearance. The cause of her death was still being contested. So at this point, things were not really moving as the police would have wished as far as the investigations were concerned. So on the 10th of December 2015, Suffolk County Police Commissioner Tim Sini announced that the FBI had officially joined the investigation. Now, this announcement came one day after former police chief James Burke was indicted for civil rights violations and conspiracy. Burke, who resigned from the department in October of 2015, was reported to have blocked FBI involvement in the Gilgo Beach cases for several years. The FBI had previously assisted in the search for victims but had never officially been a part of the investigation. So, in November of 2016, Burke was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison for assault and conspiracy. So, this case had traveled some years now, and up until this point, in as much as they found some victims and their remains, no clear breaks were happening as far as the investigation was concerned. But then, on the 12th of September 2017, Suffolk County prosecutor by name Robert Biancavilla from the County District Attorney's Office said that a man by name John Petrov, who was a carpenter from Manorville, may be responsible for some of the murders. Petrov was convicted in May of that year of the murders of 2 sex workers in 1993 and also in 1994. Now, on January 16th of 2020, Suffolk County Police Commissioner Geraldine Hart released images of a belt found at the crime scene with the letters HM or WH, depending on the angle you are looking at it from. And it didn't really make sense clearly whether it was HM or WH, because it will depend on the orientation of the belt, whether you are looking at it upside down or otherwise. The belt had been found during the initial investigation near Ocean Parkway in Gilgo Beach, and police believed that the belt was handled by the perpetrator and that it had not belonged to any of the victims. The police revealed few details about the belt's evidentiary value and would not comment on exactly where it had been found. It was also announced that new scientific evidence was being used in the investigation and that they had launched a site called gilgonews.com, which was a website that would enable the department to share news and receive tips regarding the investigation. Now, at this point, I will tip my hats off to all the security forces that coordinated on this case. This is a case that had traveled over a decade at this point, and their resolve to pursue and find justice for the victims seemed unwavering. And I think that is commendable, because at this point it was about a cold case, but they were still on it. Now, in June of 2019, a proposal was made to use genetic genealogy to identify the unidentified victims and possibly, by doing so, make a headway in identifying the killer in the Gilgo Beach case. So, on May 28th of 2020, Jane Doe number 6 was identified as Valerie Mack, who also went by the name of Melissa Taylor. So at this point, science was now helping the investigation to make some strides. Maureen Brainerd Barnes of Norwich, Connecticut, was 25 years old when she disappeared. Take note that at this point, science has come in, as at the 2020, but these disappearances occurred sometime in 2010, which included that of Maureen Brainerd Barnes. Now, when she disappeared, she was last seen heading somewhere, and that was the last that anybody saw of her. And according to the timeline, she even disappeared around 2007. And she had said at the time that she planned to spend the day in New York City. But then, like I said, she was never seen again. Brainerd Barnes was a mother of 2 and worked as a paid escort via Craigslist to pay the mortgage of her house. She had been out of the sex industry for 7 months, but she returned to the work in order to pay her bills after receiving an eviction notice. Unfortunately, her body will be found in December of 2010. Now, shortly after her disappearance, a friend of Brainerd Barnes by name Sarah Kans received a phone call from a man on an unfamiliar number. The man claimed that he had just seen Brainerd Barnes and that she was alive and staying at a whorehouse in Queens. He refused to identify himself and could not tell Kans the location of the house. He, however, told Kans he would call back and give her the address, but he never called again. Kans said that the man had no discernible New York or Boston accent. So at the time of Brainerd's disappearance, she was working at a Super 8 motel in Manhattan. Now, on the 9th of July 2007, she called a friend in Connecticut and told her that she was planning to meet a client outside of the motel. And like many of the victims, Brainerd Barnes was very petite or smallish. She was just about 4 feet 11 tall and weighed just about 105 pounds. She was found strangled later. Rest in peace to her. So she is the first of the Gilgo Four. The second of the Gilgo Four is Melissa Bartlemy. Bartlemy, who was just 24 years old, of Erie County, New York, went missing on the 12th of July 2009. Now, she had been living in Bronx in New York, working as an escort through Craigslist also. And on the night she went missing, she met with a client, deposited $900 in her bank account, and attempted to call an old boyfriend but did not get through. Beginning 1 week later and lasting for 5 weeks, her teenage sister, Amanda, received a series of vulgar, mocking and insulting calls from a man who may have been the killer using Melissa Bartlemy's cell phone. The killer, or the suspected killer in this case, asked if Amanda was a whore like her sister. The calls became increasingly disturbing and eventually culminated in the caller telling Amanda that her sister had passed and that he was going to watch her rot. Now, I don't understand what would make somebody do this. Granted, he is actually the killer. Why do you go taunting the relatives of the person whose life you've just taken? I think this is sick beyond reproach. I think that this person probably had some psycho issues and he gets off in doing these things. And looking at the fact that it was just women he was targeting, and petite women at that, I think this was how he felt he exerted his power and felt some form of dominance. So obviously it was clear that the killer is a man, not a woman. Now, police traced some of these calls to Madison Square Garden, Midtown of Manhattan, and Massapequa, but were unable to determine who was making them. Bartlemy's mother noted that there were a lot of calls to Manorville from her daughter's phone around the time of her disappearance. So, in September of 2017, prosecutors suggested that John Bitrol, a carpenter from that town, convicted of 2 other murders, might be responsible for some of the Gilgo Beach murders. Bartlemy was 4 feet in height and 95 pounds in weight, and she, just like Reynard Barnes, had also been strangled. Now, the third of the Gilgo Four was Megan Waterman, who was just 22 years old and came from South Portland, Maine. And she went missing on the 6th of June 2010 after placing adverts also on Craigslist as an escort. Now, the previous day, she had told her 20-year-old boyfriend that she was going out and would call him later. And at the time of her disappearance, she was staying at a motel in Hyde Park, New York, 15 miles northeast of Gilgo Beach. Her body was recovered in December of 2010. Now, Waterman was a mother of 1 and had been a victim of sex trafficking. Waterman was just 5 feet 5 in height, and she, like the first 2, had also been strangled. So the pattern was established now. And the fourth of the Gilgo Four was Amber Lynn Costello. Costello was just 27 years old and hailed from West Babylon in New York, which is a small town 10 miles north of Gilgo Beach. She was also a sex worker and a heroin user who went missing on the 2nd of September 2010. That night, she reportedly went to meet a stranger who had called her several times and offered $1,500 for her services. Born in Charlotte and raised in Wilmington, North Carolina, Costello was living in West Babylon, New York when she disappeared, and her family believed that she was in a residential drug rehabilitation center, and so she was not immediately reported missing when she stopped responding to messages and phone calls. Now, this is sad. Time and research has shown that serial killers prey on the vulnerable like these, excuse my language, sex traffickers, drug addicts, because they themselves are not even enjoying any empathy from the society. So serial killers know that they can target them and most often nobody will even miss them, or nobody will even think to be worried that something may have happened to them and that they may actually be missing. People just write them off and make an excuse about their disappearance in their minds. Now, prior to moving to West Babylon, Costello had been living with her second husband in Clearwater, Florida, and was working there as a waitress. A strong student, Costello's drug addiction began when she was a teenager, as she had been sexually assaulted by a neighbor when she was just 6 years old. Costello was also 4 feet 11 in height and weighed approximately 100 pounds. And just like the first three, she had also been strangled. So the pattern is clear. This killer was targeting petite women and he was mainly strangling them. Additional victims were then discovered in March and April of 2011. So within this period, 4 more sets of remains were discovered. All of the remains were found in another area off the parkway near Oak Beach and Gilgo Beach, within 2 miles to the east of those found in December 2010. The newly discovered victims were Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, an unidentified woman designated Jane Doe number 3 at the time, or Peaches, or the woman with that tattoo, and an unidentified toddler who was the daughter of Peaches. Now, for the mere fact that this killer is killing this woman is bad enough, but on the level of taking the life of a toddler, I think that it goes to show how sick this person was, how twisted and how uniquely evil this person was. Because after this person also calls some members of the families of the victims and taunts them. This person was on a different level of crazy, and police were getting so concerned because it looked like this pattern had continued for some time and nobody even saw it starting, not to talk of get on the case early enough, until this was picked up. Now, 2 further sets of remains were discovered on April 11, 2011, after the search expanded into Nassau County. They were found about 1 mile apart, approximately 5 miles west of those found in December. One set of remains belonged to a victim now thought to be a transgender woman, designated Asian male. Police said the victim had been dead for between 5 to 10 years. The other remains were those of Jane Doe number 7, whose partial remains had been discovered on Fire Island in 1996. Like I said, at these timelines, science was there alright, but it hadn't really gotten to the stage where it is now. So some people were thought as Jane Doe or they were designated as Jane Does because they couldn't be identified at the time. There was a limitation as far as the breakthrough of science existing at the time could take the police. But Valerie Mack, 24, also known as Melissa Taylor, who had been living in Philadelphia and working as an escort when she went missing in 2000, was still, the case was such that she was yet to be fully identified, because her partial remains were discovered in Manorville on 19th of November 2000, but were not identified until 2020, like I said, because of the limitations of science back then in 2000. Her torso was found wrapped in garbage bags and dumped in the woods near the intersection of Halsey Manor Road and Mill Road, adjacent to a set of power lines and a nearby power line access road. Her head and other parts of her body, which were also determined later to belong to an unidentified victim dubbed Jane Doe number 6, was later determined that they belonged to the same woman whose torso had been found in 2000. Now, the dismembered remains of Valerie Mack and Jessica Taylor were both disposed of in a similar manner and in the same part of Manorville, and this suggested to investigators that there was a link. As far as Jessica Taylor, who was just 20 years old at the time and living in Manhattan, when she went missing, On the 21st of July 2003, a naked and dismembered torso, missing some key parts of the body, were identified by DNA analysis later that year. The torso was found atop a pile of scrap wood at the end of a paved access road off Halsey Manor Road, just north of where it crosses the Long Island Expressway. Plastic sheeting was found underneath the torso, and a tattoo of her body had been mutilated with a sharp instrument. I think this was the killer's way of trying to cover up evidence of the tattoo that would have helped narrow down to identify who she was. Further remains found on March 29, 2011, matched to Taylor, including parts of her body, and it's just gruesome. I can't get into it. It's just gruesome. Now, there was another body, which at the time was unidentified, and this was on September 20th of 2011, where police released composite sketches of two of the unidentified victims, dubbed Asian Male and Jane Doe number 6, whose remains had been found in March and April of 2011, as well as photos of jewelry found on the remains of a female toddler and her mom, dubbed Jane Doe number 3, found on the 4th and 11th of April respectively. One of the sets of remains found in Nassau County on April 11 was later identified as the mom of the toddler. On June 28, 1997, the dismembered torso of an unidentified young African-American woman was found at Hampstead Lake State Park in a town of Lakeview, New York. Now, this torso was found in a green plastic Rubbermaid container, which was dumped next to a road along the west side of the lake. Investigators reported that the victim had a tattoo on her left breast of a heart-shaped peach with a bite out of it and 2 drips falling from its core. On April 11th of 2011, police in Nassau County discovered dismembered skeletal remains inside a plastic bag near Jones Beach State Park, and this victim was dubbed Jane Doe number 3. In December of 2016, Peaches, per the tattoo, and Jane Doe number 3 were positively identified as being the same person. DNA analysis also identified Peaches as the mother of baby Doe. She was found wearing gold jewelry similar to that of her daughter. So who was baby Doe? The third set of remains, the skeleton of a female toddler between 16 and 24 months of age, was found on April 4, 2011, about 250 feet away from the partial remains of Valerie Mack. Now, this body was wrapped in a blanket and showed no visible signs of trauma. DNA tests determined that the child's mother was Jane Doe number 3, whose body was found 10 miles near Jones Beach State Park. And this toddler, like I mentioned, was wearing gold earrings and a gold necklace. So this so-called killer, or so-called Long Island killer or Gilgo Beach killer, was just so unforgiving. Even children were not spared. Now, with the victim dubbed the Asian Male, the body of this young Asian male who had seemingly died from blunt force trauma was also discovered on the 4th of April 2011 at Gilgo Beach, very close to where the first 4 sets of remains had been discovered in December of 2010. Now, this victim was found wearing women's clothing and may have possibly been a transgender woman. The victim was between 17 and 23 years of age, 5 feet 6 in height, missing 4 teeth, and may have had a musculoskeletal disorder which could affect gait. The victim had been dead between 5 to 10 years, and in September of 2011, police released a male composite sketch of this Asian male victim. Jane Doe number 7, or dubbed Fire Island Jane Doe, was also found when a human skull and several teeth were recovered on April 11, 2011 at Gilgo Beach. Now, these remains were linked through DNA testing to a set of severed legs found in a garbage bag on Fire Island 15 years earlier on the 20th of April 1996. Jane Doe number 7's remains were second set to be discovered in Nassau County on the 11th of April 2011. Now, it was also noticed that Jane Doe number 7 had a surgical scar on her left leg. So at this point, things had been established to have happened to some of these women who were mostly sex workers and some also sex workers on drugs. So it was obvious who this serial killer had profiled and who his targeted victims were, but the question still lingered: who was the actual serial killer? Now, on the 13th of December 2011, police announced that the remains of Shannon Gilbert had been found in a marsh about half a mile from where she had disappeared. A week earlier, some of her clothing and belongings had been discovered in the same vicinity. Now, Gilbert was seen banging on a resident's door and screaming for help before running off into the night. Gilbert then made an emergency 911 call that night, saying that she feared for her life. Police went on to say that the death of Gilbert was the key that triggered the search during which all the bodies were found, or at least the first set, and that it was not related to the Long Island serial killer. Her now dead mother, Mary Gilbert, at the time advocated the theory that she had been murdered by a serial killer. Now let's establish the timelines. I've talked about a lot of things, I've talked about a lot of timelines, and I'm sure you are struggling to keep up. So let me simplify it for you so that you can establish these timelines right down to when Rex Heumann was arrested. So the timeline starts from 1996, specifically on the 20th of April, and this is where Fire Island Jane Doe, or Jane Doe number 7's partial remains were found on Fire Island. Next is 1997, specifically the 28th of June, where Peaches, or Jane Doe number 3's partial remains were found at Hempstead Lake State Park. Now to 2000. In the year 2000, spring or summer, Valerie Mack was last seen by family members, and on the 19th of November 2000, Valerie Mack's partial remains were found in Manorville. 2003 July was where Jessica Taylor was last seen, and 26th of July 2003 was when Jessica Taylor's partial remains were found in Manorville. 2007, specifically 9th July, was where Maureen Brainerd Barnes was last seen, and that was the month in which a friend of Brainerd Barnes by name Sarah Kans received a phone call from a man claiming that he had just seen Brainerd Barnes and that she was alive and staying at a whorehouse in Queens. 2009, specifically the 10th of July, was when Melissa Betlemy was last seen, and in that same month, between July to August of that year, Amanda Betlemy, sister of Melissa Betlemy, receives a series of vulgar mocking and insulting calls from a man using Melissa Betlemy's cell phone. Now, the caller eventually tells Amanda that her sister had passed. Fast forward to 2010, 2nd May, Shannon Gilbert makes a panicked phone call to 911 at 4:51 after fleeing a client's house in Oak Beach. She bangs on the doors of several neighboring houses and disappears. June 6th of 2010, Megan Waterman was last seen on this day. September 2nd, 2010, Amber Lane Costello was last seen on this date. December 11th, 2010, Melissa Betlemy's remains are found. And the 13th of December, 2010, Megan Waterman, Amber Lane Costello, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes' remains are also found. 2011, specifically the 29th of March, Jessica Taylor's partial remains are found at Gilgo. 4th of April 2011, remains found at Valerie Mack, Asian Male, and Baby Doe. 11th April 2011, Peaches Jane Doe number 3's further partial remains found near Jones Beach State Park. April 11th, 2011, Fire Island Jane Doe or Jane Doe number 7's further partial remains found at Tubay Beach. December 13th, 2011, Shannon Gilbert's remains are found in a marsh at Oak Beach. 2016, December, Peaches and Jane Doe number 3 are positively identified as being the same person. 2020, May, confirmation announced of forensic identification of formerly unidentified remains of Valerie Mack. And then, ultimately, in 2023, July, Rex Human was now arrested and charged in 3 of the killings, specifically that of Megan Waterman, Melissa Betlemy, and Amber Costello. Now, there are reports of other possible victims who may have also fallen at the hands of the so-called Long Island serial killer. The first of such possible victims is a lady called Tina Elizabeth Foglia, who was just 19 years old and was last seen alive in the early morning hours of the 1st of February 1982 at the Hammerheads rock music venue on Sunrise Highway, West Islip. It is reported that she had hitchhiked from her home to the venue to see a friend performing with a Queens-based band by name Equinox. Her remains were discovered by Department of Transportation workers on the 3rd of February on a shoulder of the Sacticos State Parkway in Suffolk County. The dismembered body, which had been placed in 3 separate plastic garbage bags, were found a few miles north of Robert Moses Causeway, which leads to Gilgo Beach and Oak Beach. A diamond ring that Foglia was known to wear was missing, and the DNA of an unknown male was found on the garbage bags. Police have not ruled out the possibility that Tina Foglia was an early victim of the Long Island serial killer at this time, but they had stated that the connection is not an active avenue of the investigation. Now, the second possible victim was a woman called Jacqueline Ashley Smith. Jacqueline was 16 years old and was last seen in Brooklyn, New York on the 7th of August 1999. She had left home at 9 p.m. to visit friends and never ever returned. She was reported missing on the 12th of August 1999, and on June 20th, 2000, an unidentified female torso was recovered near Beach 88th Street in Rockaway Beach, Queens. The torso was found in plastic bags and also wrapped with tape. No other body parts were recovered. The case was previously listed in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System as case number UP6058. The victim was later identified as Smith, and 2 years later, the torso of Andre Isaac was also recovered in Rockaway, not far from where Smith was found. Andre Isaac was a professional drag queen known by her stage name Sugar Bear, and he was 6'5" tall and was a 25-year-old man when he disappeared from East New York in November of 2002. Now, according to a friend, Isaac was last seen shortly before Thanksgiving getting into a car with a secret friend, so-called. Now, the vehicle was described as a red BMW type coupe driven by a Hispanic man. Isaac's torso was found close to the boardwalk on Beach 63 Street in Avenue, Queens, on the 17th of December 2002. Now, on January 25th, 2003, his head, unfortunately, was discovered by ice skaters in East Mill Pond in Morris, New York, in Suffolk County again, with a single bullet wound to the temple. His arms and legs were not found with the body and were later found in plastic bags. Isaac's case was added to the Suffolk County Police Department Gilgo News website on the 29th of May 2020. The next possible victim was also a woman called Jamie Diane Seymour. Now, Jamie Seymour, a 21-year-old escort and also, unfortunately, a drug user, was last seen in Brick, New Jersey on July 22nd, 2005. She called her father on July 22nd to let him know she was on her way to the Port Authority area to meet a client. Seymour used someone else's phone at the Manhattan Port Authority to call her mother later that day. She has also not been seen or heard from since after that. Now, after the final phone call to her mom, when 2 weeks passed and no one heard from Seymour, the family became worried, and on the 8th of August, her father reported her missing to the police. Seymour spent time prior to her disappearance in New York City and had a criminal record. There have been few leads in Seymour's case, and her sister believes that she met with foul play. Police have never indicated any connection between Seymour's disappearance and the Long Island serial killer. Seymour was a young woman with a small frame like other victims of the Long Island serial killer, and she vanished in July, similar to victims Melissa Beth Lemmy, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, and Jessica Taylor. Seymour was last seen at the same place as Jessica Taylor, the Port Authority bus station in Middletown, Manhattan. The next is Tanya Rush. Now, on the 23rd of June 2008, Tanya was last seen around 3 a.m. walking towards a subway station in Brooklyn. Her dismembered body was found by a state road cleaning crew inside a black canvas suitcase. She took up sex work to support her drug addiction, and Rush was allegedly African American and lived in the Van Dyke Houses, a Brownsville public housing complex in Brooklyn, New York. The next person is Shannon Maria Gilbert. Now, she is a 24-year-old woman and was also an escort who may have been a victim of the Long Island serial killer. She is reported to have left a client's residence in Oak Beach after midnight on the 1st of May 2010. But then, she wasn't heard of again up until her remains were found. Now, due to the controversy about Shannon Gilbert's death, in September 2014, forensic pathologist Michael Baden agreed to conduct an independent autopsy of Gilbert's remains in hopes of determining a clear cause of death. And upon examination, it was found that damage to her hyoid bone, suggesting that strangulation may have occurred. It was also noted that her body was found face up, which is not common for drowning victims. Despite this, her death is still officially listed as an accident. So, these are possible victims that may have fallen at the hand of the Long Island serial killer. And at this point, the question was long overdue that who was this so-called Long Island serial killer? Now, a profile was built. The media has speculated at the time that a killer's profile had been built, and according to the New York Times, the perpetrator is most likely a white male in his mid-20s to mid-40s and very familiar with the South Shore of Long Island and had access to bail-up sacks used to hold the bodies for disposal. It also went on to suggest that this so-called Long Island serial killer may have a detailed knowledge of law enforcement techniques and perhaps ties to law enforcement, which have thus far helped him avoid detection and ultimately capture. According to investigators, there was also the probability that there may be more than one killer. So it was at this point that various suspects were now being profiled as being possibly the Long Island serial killer. Now, let's take them one by one. It starts with a man called John Bitrov. I mentioned him earlier. Now, on the 12th of September 2017, Suffolk County Prosecutor Robert Biancavilla said that John Bitrov, who is a Suffolk County resident convicted of murdering 2 prostitutes and suspected in the murder of a third, may have actually committed some of the Gilgo Beach murders. Now, Biancavilla had said that Petrov was likely responsible for the death of other women and that there were similarities between the Gilgo Beach crime scenes and Petrov's known murders, for which he was actually convicted for in May of 2017 and sentenced in September of the same year. Petrov was arrested in 2014 after his DNA was found on two murdered women, namely Rita Tangredi and Colleen McNamee, whose bodies were found in 1993 and 1994, respectively. The match had been made through DNA submitted by his brother, who was convicted in 2013 on an unrelated case. Petrov was convicted in May 2017 of these murders and sentenced in September of the same year. At this time, the Suffolk County Police did not comment on the prosecutor's statement due to the active homicide investigation of the Gilgo Beach murders. Petrov's attorney rejected the prosecutor's assertion, however. Petrov lived in Manorville, which was 3 miles from where the torsos of Gilgo Beach victims, Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack, were recovered. Petrov was also a hunter who was said to enjoy killing animals. He was a carpenter by trade with access to hacksaws and electric saws, and because many of the bodies in the Gilgo serial killer case or the Long Island serial killer case were found precisely dismembered, Petrov's access to and proficiency with these tools became a reason for him to be suspected, coupled with the fact that he's actually a convicted murderer. Now, the grown daughter of Rita Tangredi, who was murdered by Petrov, was also the best friend of Melissa Badlemi, who was one of the Gilgo Beach victims. So you could see some links in there. So I don't think it's far-fetched that he was being looked at as a possible suspect in the Long Island serial killings. The next suspect was James Burke. Now, former Suffolk County Police Chief James Burke, or Chief James Burke, was reported to have blocked an FBI probe of the Long Island serial killer case during his time as police chief. That alone would make him a suspect, actually, because why would you decide to block it? And coupled with the fact that the profile of this so-called Long Island serial killer had a bit in there about him possibly having ties to law enforcement. So it's like James Burke was almost fitting that profile, his involvement with law enforcement as a police chief and the fact that he's blocking the FBI probe into the Long Island serial killing. Now, in November of 2016, Burke was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison for assault and conspiracy. Burke is reported to have violently assaulted a man in custody who had stolen a duffel bag from his police vehicle. The duffel bag was later found out to contain sex toys, pornography, and Viagra. Burke pleaded guilty in February of 2016 to charges of a civil rights violation and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The then district attorney in Suffolk County was convicted in December 2019 of conspiracy to cover up Burke's violent assault. Christopher McPartland, who had been Suffolk County's top anti-corruption prosecutor, was also convicted in the conspiracy. Now, in December 2016, an attorney for Shannon Gilbert's family reported that an escort had stated that she suspected that Burke might be connected to the Long Island serial killer cases. This escort, who identified herself simply as Leanne, stated that at one party she had attended in April of 2011 in Oak Beach, she had seen Burke drag a woman of Asian appearance by the hair to the ground. Take note that one of the victims of the Long Island serial killer was deemed a dark Asian male or an Asian male. So that ties in here, and it makes sense that this also that Burke would be a possible suspect at the time. According to this so-called eyewitness, she decided to engage Burke, and at the time she was not even a professional prostitute. but her encounter with him led her to suspect that he could be the Long Island serial killer. But that also didn't stick. It turns out it wasn't him. Now, the next suspect was a man called Peter Hackett. 2 days after Gilbert's disappearance, Peter Hackett, a neighbor of Joseph Brewer, who was a former physician and who had worked for Suffolk County as a police surgeon, called Shannon Gilbert's mother, Mary Gilbert. Mary Gilbert later recounted that Hackett said that he was taking care of Shannon, that he ran a home for wayward girls, and that he had given her medication because she was distressed. 3 days later, Hackett called Mary Gilbert again, denying that he had had any contact with her daughter and that he had previously phoned her. Investigators later confirmed through phone records that Hackett had indeed called Mary Gilbert twice following her daughter's disappearance. Now, the marshy area where Gilbert's remains were found was near Hackett's backyard, and her personal items and clothing were found directly behind his property in the marsh. Gilbert's family filed a wrongful death suit against Hackett in November 2012, claiming that he took Gilbert into his home that morning and administered drugs to her, facilitating her death. The lawsuit was dismissed because it could not be proven that Hackett had administered drugs or treatment to Gilbert. Later, police revealed that Hackett had a history of inserting himself into or exaggerating his role in certain major events. Police would later rule out Hackett as a suspect in the deaths of Gilbert and the Long Island serial killer victims. Hackett then left Oak Beach and moved to Florida with his family not long after Gilbert's disappearance. The next possible suspect again was James Bissett. Now, 2 days after Shannon Gilbert's remains were found, businessman James Bissett died by suicide in his car at Matutak Park. One of Bissett's businesses was a plant nursery, which was the main supplier of burlap in the region. Many of the victims' remains were found wrapped in burlap bags, so on the count of that, people were trying to draw a link to him. And in fact, because it's an investigation, that possible link will also have to be investigated and explored. And it turns out after that James Bissett was not really someone that the suspicion of being the suspected Long Island serial killer would stick on. The next was Joel Rifkin. Now, it was initially speculated that convicted serial killer Joel Rifkin, who is a former resident in Long Island, may have committed the earlier murders associated with the Long Island serial killings. Rifkin denied having anything to do with the discovered remains and was eventually freed, or it became obvious that he was not the suspect. He was cleared of those suspicions. And then the final suspect was Rex Heumann, or let me say is Rex Heumann, and his is as fresh as July of 2023. Now, Rex A. Heumann is a 59-year-old Nassau County resident, and he was arrested in Midtown Manhattan and subsequently charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, as well as 3 counts of the lesser charge of second-degree murder related to the deaths of Melissa Bedlemy, Megan Waterman, and the Amber Costello. He is also the prime suspect in the death of Maureen Brainerd Barnes. Heumann pleaded not guilty to all of these charges. Heumann is an architect and has lived much of his life in Massapequa Park on Long Island. Now, in an interview he did with a YouTuber, Heumann stated that he has worked in Manhattan since 1987. Authorities began to seriously consider Heumann as a suspect in March of 2022 after discovering that a Chevrolet Avalanche registered in his name had been linked to one of the killings by a witness. According to investigators, his cell phone records indicate he had been in contact with 3 of the 4 victims, and an email account linked to Heumann had conducted online searches of the investigation's progress. Court records also indicated that he had searched the internet for sadistic materials, child pornography, and images of the victims and their relatives. mitochondrial DNA testing indicated human as a potential match when hair found on the burlap wrappings of one of the bodies was compared to a sample gleaned from a pizza crust in a box he had discarded. Now, a potential match to human's wife was also found when comparing hair found on or near 3 of the victims to samples taken from bottles found in the trash outside the human residence. Investigators state his wife and children were out of state at the time during which the killings were believed to have occurred. So, this is a summary of the Long Island serial killings or the Gilgo Beach killings and how it has traveled from its inception over the decades to where we are currently in July of 2023, where there is now a key suspect in the person of Rex Human as being the infamous Long Island serial killer. I'm following this case, waiting to see how it will end, whether the convictions will stick and whether it would actually be proven beyond doubt in court that Rex Human truly is the Long Island serial killer. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet done so. Turn on post notifications, leave your comments in the comment section, and we'll bring you updates on this true crime case and others as and when they are due. Until then, stay safe out there and keep an eye out.